I never expected a routine day at college to change my life forever. At 23, I was focused on finishing my English coursework, not on what might happen outside the classroom. But when my professor walked into the bathroom, completely unaware of my presence, the world seemed to tilt. What started as an awkward encounter turned into something I could never have anticipated, a connection that blurred the lines between teacher and student, and set my heart racing in ways I didn't understand. This is a story of discovery, boundaries crossed, and an undeniable connection that changed everything. If you love emotionally charged LGBTQ+ stories filled with unexpected twists, don't forget to follow our page for more captivating tales. What would you do if an unexpected moment led to something life-changing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. It was late in the afternoon, and most of the students had already left campus. The hallways were quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps or the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner from the janitorial staff. I was still in the library, finishing up an essay for Professor Jameson's English class. He was strict but fair, always pushing us to think critically and express ourselves with clarity. After hours of staring at my laptop screen, I decided to take a break. Grabbing my bag, I made my way to the restroom down the hall. The building was almost empty, and the quiet was a stark contrast to the usual hustle and bustle of campus life. As I pushed open the bathroom door, I froze. There, standing by the sink, was Professor Jameson. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and he was splashing water on his face, looking far less composed than I was used to seeing him in the classroom. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes met mine in the mirror, wide with surprise, before he straightened up. "Sorry, didn't expect anyone else to be here," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of embarrassment. "No, it's fine," I stammered, stepping back instinctively. I didn't know you were here." He chuckled lightly, shaking his head as he reached for a paper towel. "Relax, it's just a bathroom." I nodded, trying to appear unfazed, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Seeing him like this, out of the usual professional context, felt strange, almost too intimate. I noticed the faint dark circles under his eyes, the way his hair was slightly disheveled. He looked human, vulnerable even, and somehow that made him even more attractive. "I take it you're burning the midnight oil too?" he asked, drying his face and turning to face me fully. "Yeah," I replied, feeling my cheeks heat. "Just trying to finish that essay for your class." He smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to soften his usual stern expression. "Good. I look forward to reading it." "Thanks," I mumbled, clutching the strap of my bag. "I'll get out of your way now." I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Wait." I glanced back, my heart skipping a beat. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You're doing good work in class. I don't say that lightly. Keep it up." The unexpected compliment left me momentarily speechless. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, and I could see something shift in his expression, a softness that wasn't there before. "Have a good night." "You too," I said, and then I was out of the door, my pulse racing as I walked down the hallway. Back in my dorm room, I replayed the interaction over and over in my head. It was such a simple moment, but it felt significant, like a crack had formed in the carefully constructed wall between professor and student. I couldn't shake the image of him by the sink, looking more real and approachable than I'd ever seen him, and for the first time I allowed myself to wonder, was there something more beneath his composed exterior, or was I just imagining it? I didn't have answers, but one thing was certain. Professor Jameson had just become far more than the man behind the podium, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. The next day in class, I couldn't focus. Every time I glanced at Professor Jameson, the memory of our encounter in the bathroom played on a loop in my head. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the situation. It was the way he looked at me, the softness in his voice when he told me I was doing well. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just a kind gesture from a teacher to a student, but the warmth in my chest lingered, and I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced every time he glanced in my direction. Class ended, and I stayed behind to gather my things while the other students filed out. Professor Jameson remained at his desk, typing something on his laptop. As I slung my bag over my shoulder and made my way toward the door, his voice stopped me. "Wait, can we talk for a second?" I turned, trying to keep my expression neutral, even as my stomach flipped. "Sure, what's up?" He gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. "Have a seat." I hesitated, but the look on his face wasn't stern. It was thoughtful, almost hesitant. I sat down, clutching my bag tightly in my lap. "I just wanted to check in with you," he began, leaning back slightly in his chair. "You've been doing really well in class, but I get the sense that something's been on your mind lately." My breath caught. "Oh, no, everything's fine." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Are you sure? You seemed a little distracted today." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I guess I just have a lot going on," I said, finally, avoiding his gaze. "Fair enough," he said, nodding. "College can be overwhelming. But if there's ever anything you need to talk about, I want you to know my door's always open." "Thanks," I said softly, feeling a warmth spread through me. "That means a lot." He smiled, the kind of smile that felt genuine and disarming. "Anyway, I won't keep you. Just wanted to make sure you're okay." I stood, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment that the conversation was over. As I reached the door, he spoke again. "Oh, one more thing." I turned back, my heart skipping a beat. "Yeah?" "There's an open mic night at the campus cafe tomorrow," he said. "I thought you might be interested. It's a great opportunity for writers to share their work." I blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. "You think I should go?" "I think you'd do well," he said, his expression earnest. "You've got a way with words. Might be nice to share that with others." I hesitated, the idea of reading something I'd written in front of a crowd making my palms sweat. But the way he looked at me, like he believed in me more than I believed in myself, made it hard to say no. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll think about it." "Good," he said, smiling again. "I'll be there too. Maybe I'll see you." As I walked out of the classroom, my mind was spinning. Was this just a teacher encouraging a student, or was there something more? I couldn't shake the feeling that our dynamic was shifting, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, or if it would lead to something I wasn't ready for. But as I headed back to my dorm, a small part of me was already planning what I might read at the open mic. And whether I admitted it to myself or not, the thought of seeing Professor Jameson there made my chest tighten in anticipation. The next evening, I found myself standing outside the campus cafe, clutching a notebook so tightly my knuckles were turning white. The faint hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter seeped through the glass doors, reminding me that this was a terrible idea. What was I even doing here? Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The cafe was cozy, with soft lighting and mismatched furniture that gave it a charming, eclectic vibe. A small stage had been set up in the corner, a single microphone standing under a spotlight. A few people were already seated, chatting quietly or flipping through their notes. I scanned the room nervously and froze when I saw him. Professor Jameson was sitting at a table near the back, his blazer draped over the chair beside him and a cup of coffee in his hand. His eyes met mine almost immediately, and a warm smile spread across his face. "You made it," he said, standing as I approached. Barely, I replied, trying to steady my voice. This isn't exactly my scene. You'll do fine, he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Nervous? Terrified, I admitted, sitting down and setting my notebook on the table. He chuckled softly. That's a good sign. It means you care. We talked for a while, and slowly my nerves began to ease. He had a way of making me feel seen, like my thoughts and feelings mattered. It was a rare gift, and it made me want to impress him even more. As the event started, I listened to the other participants share their work, poems, essays, short stories. The room was filled with snaps and applause, the kind of encouragement that felt genuine and supportive. But as my turn approached, my anxiety spiked again. You'll be great, Professor Jameson said, his voice low and steady. Just take your time. When my name was called, I stood on shaky legs and made my way to the stage. The lights were bright, and for a moment I couldn't see anything beyond the microphone. But then I caught a glimpse of him, sitting calmly in the back, his expression encouraging. I read my piece, a short essay about identity and finding my place in the world. My voice wavered at first, but as the words flowed, I felt a sense of catharsis. By the time I finished, the room erupted into applause, and I stepped off the stage, my heart racing but full. Back at the table, Professor Jameson was waiting with a proud smile. That was incredible, he said. You have a real talent. Thanks, I said, my cheeks burning. I don't think I could have done it without you. Don't sell yourself short, he replied. The talent is all yours. I just gave you a little push. We stayed for the rest of the event, and when it ended, he walked me to the door. The night air was crisp, and the quiet of campus felt almost surreal after the warmth of the cafe. I'm glad you came, he said, his hands in his pockets. It was good to see you out of your comfort zone. Me too, I admitted, looking up at him. Thanks for encouraging me. He smiled, his gaze lingering on mine. Any time. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. The streetlights cast a soft glow, and the space between us seemed to shrink. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but something unspoken passed between us, something that made my heart pound. Good night, he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Good night, I replied, watching as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. As I made my way back to my dorm, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated and far more meaningful than I'd ever anticipated. The days following the open mic night felt different. Every time I walked into Professor Jameson's classroom, I felt a shift in the air, a quiet awareness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just me. His gaze seemed to linger longer, his words softer, almost personal. I told myself I was imagining it, but the memory of that night, the way he'd smiled at me, the way his voice had dropped when he said goodnight, kept replaying in my mind. One afternoon, I found myself in the library, working on an essay for his class. The quiet hum of students around me should have helped me focus, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I had just started typing when a familiar voice broke my concentration. Hard at work, I see. I looked up to find Professor Jameson standing on the other side of the table, a coffee cup in hand and that same disarming smile on his face. Trying to be, I said, my cheeks heating. What brings you here? He gestured toward the book he was holding. Looking for something to supplement a lecture. What about you? Working on the essay for next week? Yeah, it's harder than I thought, I admitted, glancing at the half-written document on my laptop. He nodded, setting his coffee down and pulling out a chair. Mind if I join you? Not at all, I said, trying to keep my voice steady as he sat across from me. For the next hour, we talked about the essay, my ideas, and writing in general. His feedback was thoughtful and encouraging, but it was the way he spoke to me, as if I was more than just a student, that made my chest tighten. At one point, his hand brushed mine as he reached for his coffee. The touch was brief, but sent a jolt through me. I glanced up to find him looking at me, his expression unreadable. "You're doing great," he said softly. "Don't be too hard on yourself." "Thanks," I murmured, my heart racing. Later that evening, I was still thinking about our conversation when my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. "Jameson, I don't usually do this, but I enjoyed our talk today. Thanks for letting me crash your study session." My breath caught as I stared at the message. What did this mean? Was it just a friendly note, or was there something more behind it? After a moment, I replied, "I should be thanking you. Your advice really helped." His response came quickly. "Jameson, happy to help. Maybe we should make it a regular thing." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. A regular thing? The thought thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. But instead of overthinking, I typed back, "I'd like that." The following week, we met again in the library. This time, it wasn't just about the essay. We talked about everything: books, music, life. It was easy, natural, and yet there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. As we packed up to leave, he hesitated, glancing around the quiet library before speaking. "I don't want you to think I'm crossing any lines," he said, his voice low. "But I enjoy spending time with you." My throat tightened, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Finally, I found my voice. "I do too." His eyes searched mine, and I could feel the weight of unspoken words between us. But before either of us could say more, someone walked by, and the moment was lost. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The boundaries between us were blurring, and I didn't know what to do about it. All I knew was that every time I saw him, every time we talked, I felt like I was falling further into something I couldn't control, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Every interaction with Professor Jameson felt loaded with unspoken words, subtle glances, and the tension that neither of us dared to address directly. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, like standing on the edge of a cliff and not knowing whether to jump or step back. One evening, I stayed late after class to work on an assignment. The campus was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel amplified. As I sat alone in the classroom, the door opened, and there he was, Professor Jameson, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up as always. "You're still here?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just finishing up some work." He walked over and leaned against the desk next to mine. "You've been putting in a lot of effort lately. It's not going unnoticed." "Thanks," I said, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I guess I've just been inspired." He chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on me. Inspiration's a powerful thing. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. I could feel the tension building, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been growing between us. It felt like we were on the brink of something, but neither of us was willing to take the first step. Finally, he broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, my heart pounding. He hesitated, his expression serious. "Have I made you uncomfortable? With the time we've spent together, I mean." The question caught me off guard, and I shook my head quickly. "No, not at all. If anything, I've appreciated it." His eyes searched mine, and I could see the conflict in them. "I need you to know that I value you, not just as a student, but as a person, and that's why this is so complicated." I swallowed hard. the weight of his words pressing down on me. "It doesn't have to be," I said quietly. He looked at me for a long moment, and then something shifted in his expression. Without saying a word, he reached out, his hand brushing mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and before I knew it, I was leaning in, closing the gap between us. When our lips met, it was like the world fell away. The kiss was tentative at first, but it deepened quickly, filled with all the emotions we'd been holding back. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and completely unlike anything I'd ever experienced. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "This isn't professional," he said, his voice tinged with both regret and longing. "I don't care," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "This feels right." He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," I said, my hand still resting on his. "We don't have to figure it all out right now, but we can't keep pretending this doesn't exist." He nodded, his conflict evident but his resolve softening. "You're right," he said finally. "We'll take it one step at a time." For the first time in weeks, the tension between us eased, replaced by a quiet understanding. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without complications, but it was ours. The days after our kiss felt like stepping into uncharted territory. We didn't talk about it directly, but the weight of what had happened lingered in every interaction. In class, we maintained professionalism, careful not to draw any attention, but in the quiet moments when no one else was around, the connection between us felt undeniable. One evening, he texted me, "Can we talk?" I replied immediately, "Of course. Where?" His response was quick. "The park behind campus. 7 p.m. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench under a canopy of trees. The soft glow of the streetlights cast a warm light on his face, and for a moment, I just stood there, taking him in. This was the man who had challenged me, inspired me, and now somehow become more than just my professor. "You came," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Of course," I replied, sitting beside him. "What's on your mind?" He exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what this means." "And?" I prompted, my heart pounding. He looked at me, his expression open and raw. "I can't pretend this doesn't exist anymore. I've tried to push it aside, to rationalize it, but I can't." Neither of us spoke for a moment, the weight of his confession settling between us. Finally, I reached out, my hand brushing his. "So, what do we do?" "We take it one step at a time," he said, his voice firm. "No rushing, no hiding who we are, but we need to be careful." "I can handle careful," I said with a small smile, "as long as we're honest with each other." He smiled, and for the first time, I saw a sense of peace in his eyes. "Then let's see where this takes us." From that night on, everything changed. We navigated our relationship quietly, balancing the boundaries of our roles with the growing feelings we couldn't ignore. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of doubt and fear, but through it all, we found strength in each other. Looking back, that one unexpected moment in the bathroom had set off a chain of events I could never have imagined. It had been the start of something complicated, beautiful, and entirely worth the risk. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to follow our page for more captivating LGBTQ+ tales. What would you do if love came from the most unexpected place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story.